No one in Cairnley Court had wished the Duke of Cairnley many happy returns in 20 years, and Verity Reed, a bare 6 weeks a wife, did not yet know it was a rule until she broke it. She had married him for a roof and a ledger to keep, on terms stated so plainly that neither of them had thought to dress the arrangement up as anything finer. And she had been in the house scarcely long enough to learn which stair creaked before she found herself outside his study door, with a cake balanced on both hands, listing badly to the left, like a ship that had given up on the idea of north. She did not know yet that the cake would crack open a silence 20 years thick, or that it would very nearly cost her the roof she had married to keep. Had she known, she would have carried it up the stairs all the same. It had begun that morning with 2 housemaids in the linen passage, their voices dropped to the particular hush reserved for the dead or the dangerous. Not today, one had said. Not since the old Duke. The other had shushed her so fast that Verity, coming round the corner with an armful of table linen, had caught only the tail of it, and the 2 girls had gone the colour of scoured pewter, and fled in opposite directions, as though she were the one who ought to be ashamed. She had asked Mrs. Nettle about it over the account books that afternoon, phrasing it lightly, the way she had learned to phrase most things in that house. Is there something particular about today? Mrs. Nettle had gone on scrubbing a pot that did not need scrubbing. It is His Grace's birthday, she said, in the tone a woman uses for a debt long since written off. 30 years old today. And nobody in this house has wished him many happy returns in 20 of them, and nobody will, and you would do well to leave it lying, Your Grace, the way we all have. Verity had not been raised to leave things lying. Her father had kept books for half the merchants of a middling port town, and he had taught her before he taught her to write her name that an account left unbalanced only grew heavier with time, never lighter, and that the sums a person refused to look at were always, without exception, the ones that mattered most. She thought of that now, turning the ledger's brass corner under her thumb the way she always did before she said something she suspected would not be welcome. "Then tell me why," she said. Mrs. Nettle's hands went still in the water. "That, Your Grace, is not mine to tell. It is his, if he ever chooses to give it, and I'd not hold my breath, nor would I advise you to hold yours." But she had told her enough, in the end, that Verity understood the shape of the thing even without its centre, that the old Duke had died on this very day when his son was 10 years old, at a feast the boy himself had begged for, and that the house had folded up its celebrations that year and never opened them again, and that the young Duke, grown now grave and grey-eyed, and silent as a shuttered window, had never once asked for the folding to stop. Mrs. Nettle had also mentioned, with the particular carelessness people use for the thing they most want you to hear, that Michaelmas was 3 weeks off, and that Mr. Edmund would be coming with the London solicitor to go over the year's accounts as he did every quarter day since anyone could remember, and that His Grace always seemed a shade greyer in the weeks before it than after. Verity had filed that away, the way she filed away every loose thread in a house full of them, and had gone, instead of to her needlework, to the kitchen, where she informed Mrs. Nettle with more confidence than the facts supported that she intended to bake a cake. Mrs. Nettle had looked at her the way one looks at a horse that has announced its intention to fly. "You cannot bake, Your Grace." "I can keep an honest ledger," Verity said. "I make no promises about cake." It came out of the oven 40 minutes later, leaning hard to the left, sunken in its middle like a man who has been told bad news, and smelling faintly, though she could not account for how, of scorched pennies. She iced it anyway, badly, with a hand better suited to columns of figures than to sugar, and she carried it up the great staircase past 2 footmen, who did not so much look at her as flinch from her, and she knocked on the study door before her courage could catch up with the rest of her and tell her to put it down. He did not raise his voice when he said come, and she had learned in 6 weeks that he never did, that the loudest thing about the Duke of Kenley was his stillness. He was at his desk with his father's signet turning slowly under his thumb, the way it always turned when something in the room troubled him, before he had decided to let his face know it. And when he saw what she carried, he went so quiet that for a moment she thought she had misjudged everything. The house, the day, the whole delicate architecture of their bargain. "Your Grace," she said, because the terms of the marriage had specified she would call him that in company, and he had never once corrected her when they were alone. Many happy returns. He looked at the cake for a long moment, and then at her, and something crossed his face too fast to be read, and too slow to be entirely hidden, and he said, in a voice gone rough at the edges, "No one has said that to me since I was a boy." "I know," she said. "I was told expressly not to say it." "And yet," he said, and yet she agreed, and set the cake down on the corner of his desk, careful not to disturb the ledgers, because even in defiance she was tidy. He did not eat it. He looked at it as a man looks at a door he has kept locked so long he has forgotten what lies on the other side, and she understood that she had stepped somewhere she had not been invited. The terms of their arrangement, drawn up over a fortnight of careful, feeling less negotiation 2 months before, had never once accounted for cake. "You will have the running of my household and a settlement upon my death," he had told her across Mr. Whitlock's office table, "and I will have a wife within the year my father's will requires, and neither of us need pretend to more than that." She had asked, because her father had also taught her never to sign an account she had not read in full. Why her? "Because you are sensible," he had said, "and because you will not weep at me, and because Mr. Whitlock assures me your character is beyond reproach, which is more than can be said for most of the ladies who have been paraded past me this 12-month for the sake of my title." She had said she required no affection, and would offer none she did not feel, and he had said that suited him very well, and they had shaken hands on it like 2 merchants closing a fair bargain. She had not accounted then for the way his hand looked now, motionless above a cake that leaned like a drunk man, or for the sound he made that was not quite a laugh. "This is a terrible cake," he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Nettle told me so at every stage of its construction." He picked up the small silver knife from his own desk drawer, the one he used for letters, and cut 2 slices, and handed her one on a torn corner of blotting paper because there was no plate in the room, and he ate his standing at the window with his back half to her, which she was already beginning to understand was as close to weeping as he allowed himself. "It is very bad," he said again, after he had finished it. "Yes," she said. "Will you have more, Mrs.?" Nettle appeared in the doorway then, drawn by some servant's instinct for disaster or its opposite, and stopped dead at the sight of the ruined cake and the half-eaten slice in the Duke's hand, and pressed both hands to her apron, and said nothing at all, which from Mrs. Nettle was itself a kind of thunderclap. Cousin Edmund arrived 3 days later, ahead of his usual season, which Mrs. Nettle remarked upon with the particular dryness she reserved for things she found ominous. He came in a travelling coat, the colour of good claret, and gloves so pale they looked never to have touched anything, and he kissed Verity's hand with a gentleness that made the hair rise along her arms, though she could not have said why. since nothing in his manner was anything but courteous. "My dear cousin's wife," he said, "I have heard the house is livelier since your arrival. I understand there was a cake." News apparently travelled faster than good sense in that household, and she wondered, not for the first time, how much of what happened behind closed doors in Cairnley Court found its way eventually to cousin Edmund's ear. "It was not very good cake," she said. "No," he agreed, smiling with all his teeth and none of his eyes. "I imagine it was not." He touched, as he spoke, the black mourning ring on his smallest finger, a habit she would come to know so well she could have set a clock by it, though she did not yet understand what grief the ring commemorated, or why a man so evidently at ease in the world should carry it at all. "Michaelmas will be upon us directly," he said, turning the ring once more, "and we must have the accounts entirely in order this year, for the solicitor tells me the terms of the will are to be reviewed with particular care, given certain changes in the household." He said, certain changes in the household, the way a man lays a card face down on the table, letting you feel its weight without showing you its face. And Verity, who had spent a childhood watching her father read the faces of men who owed him money, understood that she had just been threatened in the politest language available in the English tongue. Alistair, standing beside her with his hand very still at his side, said only, "The accounts have always been in order, Edmund, and I do not doubt they will be found so again." Edmund had laughed, a light and pleasant sound, and said, of course, I only mean to be thorough, cousin, as you have always known me to be." Below stairs the household had a great deal more to say about it, none of it in Verity's hearing, though she gathered the shape of it from the way the footman straightened when Edmund passed and slouched again the instant he had gone. "Mister, Edmund has a gift." "Mister's," Nettle said, flouring a board with more force than the dough required, for making a room colder without once raising the temperature of his own voice. "He has done it since he was a boy of 12, watching his uncle hand the title to a nephew and not to him." Verity asked, carefully, whether Mr. Edmund had wanted the title very badly. "Wanted is a small word for it," Mrs. Nettle said, and would say no more, though her hands had gone hard and quick against the dough, kneading out something that was not flour. It was 3 days after that, going over the household accounts in the small morning room that had become, without either of them remarking upon it, her particular territory, that Verity first noticed the thing that would not let her alone. It was nothing so grand as a forgery, not then, only a column of figures in an old ledger from 20 years past, kept for the kitchen and cellar accounts, where a hand she did not recognise had entered, month after month for the better part of a year, a payment to an apothecary in the nearest market town for a cordial for the old Duke's heart, the sums climbing steadily, almost imperceptibly, the way a tide climbs a beach. She had no reason yet to think anything of it beyond the ordinary sorrow of an old man's failing health, and she closed the ledger and set it back on its shelf, and thought no more of it that day, though she would remember, much later, that she had thought no more of it, and wonder at her own blindness, the way one wonders at a door one has passed 100 times without noticing it was locked. The accounts became, over the following fortnight, the thing that brought them together in the evenings, since Alistair had discovered, with the faint surprise of a man unearthing an unlooked-for coin in an old coat, that his wife could read a ledger better than any steward he had employed. She showed him, one night by candlelight with the ink barely dry, how the tenant rents from the northern farms had been quietly under-recorded for years against what the rent rolls themselves implied, a discrepancy so small in any single year that no one auditor had ever thought it worth chasing, and so persistent across 2 decades that it now amounted to a sum that made him set down his glass very carefully, as a man sets down a thing he is afraid of dropping. My father trusted Edmund with those rolls from the year I turned 10, he said. He has kept them ever since. He did not say what else had happened the year he turned 10, and she did not press him, because she had learned by then that the grave places in him opened only when he chose the hour, never when asked. He told her instead, unprompted, staring into the fire with his father's ring turning slow beneath his thumb, that it had been his own idea, the birthday feast, that he had begged his father for it, though the old Duke's health had been failing all that year. My father trusted me with a wish, he said, and my father had smiled and said, of course, whatever my boy wishes, and had collapsed at his own table not 4 hours later, with the candles still burning and the musicians still playing, as though the house itself had not yet been told to stop. I have never wanted a birthday since. It seemed a discourtesy to the dead. To want one. There is a difference, she said, between wanting the day and wanting to be forgotten, and I do not think your father, who by every account doted on you, would have chosen the second for you if he had been given the choosing. He looked at her for a long moment, the fire moving gold across one side of his face, and said, You are the first person in this house in 20 years to say that to me plainly. Someone had to, Your Grace, she said, since the rest of them are apparently sworn to a conspiracy of silence, which drew from him a sound she had not heard before, low and startled and entirely unguarded. It took her a moment to recognize as a laugh. It was, she thought afterward, turning it over the way she turned over a well-balanced sum, the first time she had heard it, and she found she wanted very much to hear it again. There is not much use, he said, once it had faded, in a wife who tells a man only what he wishes to hear. I did not marry a wife for use, she said, though her heart had picked up its pace saying it. I married, or rather you married, a bookkeeper who cannot resist an unbalanced column, and I find your household is full of them. He laughed again, shorter this time, and reached across the small distance between their two chairs and took her hand. Not as a suitor takes a hand, but as a man takes hold of something solid in a room that has begun, very slightly to tilt. They sat like that a while without speaking, the fire cracking, the ledger open and forgotten between them, and she thought that whatever else this marriage had been built from, it was no longer only terms and settlements, though neither of them yet had a better word for what it had become. The blow, when it came, arrived on a Tuesday with Edmund's card and no warning, and it arrived, as the worst blows in that house always seemed to, in the gentlest possible voice. He found Alistair alone in the library, and Verity only just entering behind him, unseen in the doorway, and he said, My dear cousin, I hesitate to trouble you with a delicate matter, but I have had it from more than 1 quarter that your wife's late father left considerable debts behind him in his trade, debts some say were never honestly incurred, and I would be a poor kinsman if I let you walk into my Michaelmas, without knowing the solicitor may ask hard questions about the character of the household you have joined your name to. It was, Verity understood at once, standing frozen in the doorway, with her hand still on the frame, only half a lie, which was the worst kind Edmund dealt in, because her father had indeed died in debt, ruined by a partner's fraud he had never lived to see exposed. She stepped into the room before Alistair could answer, because she had never in her life let another party speak the sum of her own accounts, and said, My father was cheated by a man he trusted with his ledgers, Miss Edmund, and died of the shame of it, though the shame was never his to carry. and I would be glad to show you the court records that say so, if you have not already read them, which I rather think you have." Edmund's smile did not move an inch, but his fingers found the black ring and turned it once, twice, and he said, of course, I meant no insult, only that others less generous than myself may ask. And it is always wisest to have one's answers ready before Michaelmas rather than after." He left soon after, all courtesy, and Alistair did not speak until the door had closed behind him, and then he said only, "Is it true?" Something in the plainness of the question, asked without cruelty, but also without the certainty she had begun to hope for, cut deeper than Edmund's whole performance had managed. "It is true my father died in debt," she said. "It is not true he earned it dishonestly, and if you doubt me on that after 6 weeks of my company, you have learned less of me than I had thought." She saw him hear the edge in it, saw him weigh it, and she watched him choose, visibly, to set his suspicion down rather than carry it further, though the choosing cost him something she could see in the tightness around his eyes. "Forgive me," he said. "I have spent 20 years watching that man make the truth sound like a lie and the lie sound like mercy, and I did not think until this moment how easily he might do the same to you." It was the nearest thing to an apology she had yet had from him, and she took it, though the sting of the question lingered longer than either of them acknowledged aloud, a small hairline crack in the room's warmth that neither of them yet knew how to mend. Edmund came again within the week, this time alone, this time finding her in the morning room with the household ledgers spread before her, as they so often were, and he closed the door behind him with a softness that felt, in that small room, louder than a slam. "I will be plain with you," he said, "since plainness seems to be a currency you value. I do not think you a bad woman, only an inconvenient one, arrived at an inconvenient season, and I am prepared to make your inconvenience considerably lighter." He named a sum then, quietly, as one names a fair price and not a bribe, enough to settle whatever remained of her father's debts twice over and set her up modestly and independently for the whole of her life, in exchange for a quiet word to the solicitor at Michaelmas that the marriage had been entered into for material comfort alone. "Take the money," he said, "take your name back, and you need never again live beneath a roof where you were married for a ledger and a line in a will." She sat very still, her thumb finding the brass corner of the account book before her out of pure habit, and she thought of her father, who had taught her that a woman with an honest column need never fear an audit, however hard the auditor pressed. "I did not marry his grace for comfort, Mr. Edmund," she said, "and I will not sell what little truth I have for the price of more of it. If the solicitor wishes to ask me hard questions at Michaelmas, he is welcome to ask them, and I will answer every one, in daylight, with witnesses, which is more than I think you would care to offer of yourself." Something moved behind Edmund's eyes then, brief and cold, gone before she could name it, and he only said, "A pity," and let himself out. She sat alone afterward with her hands not quite steady, understanding that she had refused not merely money, but a door standing open, and that the room beyond it, whatever it held, would now have to be entered the harder way, through the middle, in full view of everyone. The darkest of it came 10 days before Michaelmas, when Edmund's man of business, a nervous, ink-stained clerk named Sowerby, whom Verity had met only once in passing, arrived at Cairnley Court with a sealed letter for Alistair that emptied every trace of colour from his face as he read it, and he said nothing of its contents to her that whole evening, only shut himself in his study with the door locked, which he had not done since the first week of their marriage. She stood outside it a long while, her hand raised as it had been raised the day of the cake, and did not knock, because she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has learnt to read a house by its silences, that some doors open only from within. She learned the substance of the letter only the next morning, from Mrs. Nettle, ashen-faced over the kitchen fire, and it was worse than she had feared. A formal notice from the family solicitor that certain irregularities had come to light in the household accounts, bearing Verity's hand upon them. Entries in her own ledger that did not match the sums she swore she had recorded. "Someone has been in my books," Verity said, very quietly, and Mrs. Nettle only pressed her lips together and said nothing, which frightened Verity more than any answer could have. That night, unable to sleep, she went down to the kitchen for want of anywhere else to put her restlessness, and found Mrs. Nettle sitting alone by the banked fire with an old copper tin in her lap, turning it over and over the way a woman turns over a decision she has carried too long. "I should have given this to him years ago," Mrs. Nettle said, not looking up, "and I did not, because I was afraid of the man who would have taken it from me if he ever knew I had it, and because his old Grace told me, dying, to give it to his son only when he was a man grown, and free to choose, and I did not trust myself to know when that day had come, until I watched him eat a bad cake and laugh for the first time in 20 years, and thought, well, there it is then." She held out the tin. "It was his mother's, for recipes," she said. "There is one more folded inside than there ought to be." Verity took it into her 2 hands, feeling its dented copper cool against her palms, and beneath the first recipe card, in a dying man's hand grown thin and hurried at the end, she found writing that was not a recipe at all, and read the first line before her courage failed her, and set it down again, because some doors, she understood, ought not to be opened alone, at midnight, by candlelight, with the man they concerned asleep and unknowing 3 floors above. She brought the tin to him at first light, before either of them had dressed for the day, and he read the letter inside standing at the window exactly as he had stood over the cake, his father's ring gone still at last beneath his thumb, because his hand, for once, was not moving at all. His father had written it in the last hours of his life, in a script that wandered and steadied and wandered again, and it said that he did not trust his cousin Edmund with the whole truth of the estate's health, that the cordial he had lately been given for his heart left him strange and weak in ways his old physician's remedies never had, that he had altered nothing in his will himself concerning marriage and trusteeship, beyond his own true wish. Written years before, that his son not spend his life as lonely as his father had spent the years after his wife's death. There was no accusation of murder in it, nothing so bold, only the careful, frightened suspicion of a dying man too weak to act on it himself, and beneath the letter, folded smaller still, a copy in his own hand of the marriage clause, as he had truly written it, with no word anywhere of trusteeship or forfeiture, only a father's plain hope that his son would one day choose a wife freely, and not go through the world as unaccompanied as he had. Alistair read it twice through before he spoke, and when he did his voice was not the grave, controlled voice she had come to know, but something rawer beneath it. 20 years, he said, 20 years I forbade this house from wishing me happy returns, because I believed I had somehow killed him by wanting a party, and it was never my wanting that killed him at all. Verity took the account-book from beneath her arm, the old kitchen and cellar ledger with its climbing column of apothecaries' payments, and set it beside his father's letter on the desk, and together, for the better part of that whole grey morning, they laid the 2 documents side by side, and began, at last, to do the sum properly. They did not go to Edmund. They went instead, quietly, by a private letter and a private meeting arranged for 2 days before Michaelmas, to Mr. Aldous Whitlock, the family's solicitor of 30 years' honest service, a spare, careful man who polished his spectacles for a full minute before he would allow himself to comment on anything. "This is a grave matter, Mrs. Red," he said at last, "and I will not pretend otherwise, nor will I act on suspicion where certainty is wanted. Bring me the apothecary's original receipts if they yet exist. Bring me the will as it was filed 20 years ago against this copy in the old Duke's hand, and bring me, if you can, some soul in that house who was present at the making of the filed will, and can speak to whether it was altered after the fact, and I will see justice done at Michaelmas before every witness the estate can gather, in the light, where such things belong." It was Mrs. Nettle who found the last thread, 2 days later, in the person of Sowerby himself, discovered weeping quietly in the stable yard over a flask he had no business carrying at that hour of the morning. He had been, it emerged in halting, miserable pieces, a junior copyist 20 years before in the office that had drawn up the old Duke's will, bribed as a frightened young man with more debts than sense to alter a single clause and witness a signature that was never truly made in his presence. And he had lived every year since under Edmund's soft, unwavering reminder of what a confession would cost him. "I have wanted to be rid of it for 20 years, he told Verity, and I did not have the courage until I watched a woman ask a man for the truth and refuse to take money instead of it. He agreed, white-faced but resolved, to speak at Michaelmas, and Verity, walking back to the house with the last piece of the account settled in her mind at last, felt for the first time in weeks the particular, clean satisfaction of a ledger finally brought, after long and patient searching, into perfect and undeniable balance. That evening, watching Edmund's coach roll in a day early up the long drive, its lamps sweeping gold across the darkening lawn, she saw him pause on the step before entering, straighten his cuffs, touch the black ring at his smallest finger, and go very still for a moment, staring up at the lit windows of the house he had spent 20 years believing should have been his. She thought, watching him, that whatever else he was, he did not yet know that the house had already begun, quietly, to close its accounts against him. Michaelmas morning came in grey and mild, the kind of light that makes no promises either way, and the library at Cairnley Court filled by 10 o'clock with more witnesses than any quarter-day audit had ever required. Mr. Whitlock at the great table with his spectacles and his careful stack of papers, Sowerby seated near the door looking as though he might yet bolt, Mrs. Nettle standing rigid by the hearth with her hands twisted in her apron, Lady Cassandra Fenwick seated with her gloves folded neat in her lap and her chin very level, and half the household besides crowded discreetly near the doors. Edmund arrived last, unhurried, in claret and pale gloves, and took the chair offered him with the easy grace of a man who has never once doubted the outcome of any room he has entered. "Shall we begin?" he said, smiling around at all of them. "I understand my cousin has been busy with his books." Alistair did not smile back. He set 2 documents on the table before Whitlock, side by side, and said, in a voice that did not rise but filled the room all the same, "This is the will as it was filed 20 years ago, naming my cousin trustee of this estate should I fail to marry by my 30th year, upon forfeiture of my inheritance. And this is my father's own hand, written the night he died, in which no such clause exists at all." Whitlock lifted each in turn to the light from the tall windows, held them side by side, and read aloud, slowly, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who has spent his career letting documents speak for themselves, first the filed clause and then the true one, and the difference between a father's plain hope and a forger's careful threat rang out into the room with a clarity no argument could have matched. "Forgeries are easily claimed and rarely proven, cousin," Edmund said lightly. "Then let us prove it," Alistair said, and nodded to Whitlock, who called Sowerby forward. "Mr. Sowerby," Whitlock said, holding up the filed will's witnessing signature beside a fresh sample of the clerk's own hand written that very morning under the solicitor's eye, "is this your signature?" Sowerby's throat worked twice before any sound came. "It is," he said. "And were you present, as this document claims, when the old Duke signed the clause it bears?" The room had gone entirely silent, even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "I was not," Sowerby said, and the words came faster now, tumbling, 20 years damned behind them. "I was paid to witness a signature that was made in another room by another hand, and told what would happen to me and mine if I ever said so, and I have lived with it every day since, and I am done living with it now." Edmund rose halfway from his chair, the first crack in 20 years of composure showing plain across his face, and said, "This is a servant's fancy, a debtor's tale." Whitlock, polishing his spectacles with maddening calm, said only, "We have not yet come to the ledgers. Mr. Red, perhaps you would care to sit." He laid the old kitchen and cellar accounts before them all, the apothecary's climbing payments for a cordial that, as Whitlock read out from a second physician's sworn statement obtained that very week, contained foxglove in doses that grew, month upon month, from a gentle remedy into a slow and deliberate poison, matched precisely against a set of purchase receipts bearing, in the corner of each, Edmund's own youthful initials. "Read where it is dated," Alistair said quietly, and Whitlock did, the final receipt falling exactly 9 days before the old Duke's death. Into the silence that followed, Verity, watching Edmund's face rather than the papers, saw at last the grief beneath the ambition, the black ring turning and turning, and heard him say, in a voice gone suddenly older than his years, "He was to have given me the Western farms. You know. My own uncle promised me a portion when I was a boy of 12, and gave the whole of it instead to a son born of a marriage he barely troubled to attend, and told me I must be content to serve where another was born to rule. And I buried my own boy 2 winters after, of a fever a proper physician might have caught in time, had I ever had the means such men take for granted. And I found I could no longer be content with anything at all. No one in the room spoke. Alistair, when he did not raise his voice, though something in it had gone very quiet and very final. "I am sorry for your son," he said. "I am sorry for whatever my father failed to give you. And I am sorrier still that you chose to take a father from me rather than ask honestly for what you believed you were owed. But I will not have you tried before this county like a common poisoner, to drag my father's name and yours through every assize broadsheet between here and London. You will sign the estate's accounts over in full to Mr. Whitlock's keeping. You will remove yourself abroad within the month, and you will have, from my own hand and no one else's charity, an allowance sufficient to live without want for the whole of your life, on the single condition that you never again set foot on Cairnley land. It is not mercy you have earned, Edmund, it is mercy I choose to give, because I find I would rather be a man who forgives too easily than one who becomes, in hunting you down, anything at all like you." Edmund said nothing for a long moment, and then, very low, he said, "Your father would be proud of that speech which was, Verity thought. watching him gather himself and rise and walk out through the library's great doors into the grey Michaelmas light, without once looking back. The truest and saddest thing he had said all morning. The house exhaled, in the days that followed, the way a house exhales after a long fever finally breaks, and it was in the quiet aftermath of it, 3 evenings later, that Alistair found Verity in the small morning room among her ledgers, and said, without any of his usual careful weighing of words, that he had something to settle with her that had nothing to do with accounts. The will, as it truly stands, requires nothing of me now, he said. I need not have married at all to keep this house, and did not know it when I asked you, and I have spent 3 days turning that over and finding I am glad of it anyway, because it means that whatever I say to you now, I say it owing nothing to any clause or deadline, only to you. He crossed the small room and knelt, not dramatically but simply, the way a man kneels to look someone properly in the eye, and said, I did not marry you for love, Verity, because I did not believe, that first day in Whitlock's office, that love was a thing left for me to have. But I have watched you refuse a fortune sooner than sell a lie, and bake the worst cake in the history of this county sooner than let a silence stand unchallenged, and I find I would rather have your bad cake and your honest ledger than every comfortable wordless year I spent before you came. Marry me again, he said. Though we are already wed, marry me because you wish it, and not because any will requires it. It is the only reason I will ever ask you to take. She laughed, unsteady, and said, I told you once I make no promises about cake, and she found she was crying a little as she said it. Then promise me nothing about cake, only about the rest of it, he said, and she said yes, and he kissed her gently, in the grey afternoon light of a room that smelled of ink and dust, and, faintly still, of scorched sugar. They were married again the following month in the small chapel at Cairnley, quietly, with no more than 30 souls present, where the county had once expected 300, Mrs. Nettle weeping openly through the whole of it, and loudly denying afterward that she had wept at all. Lady Cassandra Fenwick, standing witness, in a gown of unshowy grey and smiling, for the first time Verity had seen, without any calculation behind it at all, having lately accepted the quiet courtship of a widowed baronet from the next county, who valued her wit above her connections. Sowerby was given, at Whitlock's recommendation and Alistair's insistence, a modest but honest post in a country solicitor's office 2 counties distant, where he was said to keep the most scrupulously honest books in the district. As though 20 years of guilt had been distilled, at last, into simple and permanent care. And Edmund Reed, they heard eventually through the careful distant channel of a quarterly bank draft duly sent and duly acknowledged, had settled in a small town on the Italian coast, where he was said to keep entirely to himself and to tend, with unexpected gentleness, a garden. It was nearly a year later, on a morning grown just cool enough to promise autumn, that Verity stood once more outside her husband's study door, with a cake balanced on both hands, listing, as it always seemed to, faintly to the left, and a robin singing somewhere in the ivy below the window the way it had sung. She would swear, on the very first morning she carried a cake up that staircase. The whole household had gathered this time, uninvited and unashamed, filling the corridor behind her, Mrs. Nettle at the front with her arms crossed, and her eyes already suspiciously bright, and when Verity knocked and heard him say come, she opened the door to find him already smiling, already risen from his desk, his father's ring resting easy and still on his hand. Many happy returns, Your Grace, she said, and this year the whole house said it with her, a ragged, overlapping chorus of voices that had not spoken those words aloud in over 2 decades. Alistair Red, Duke of Cairnley, stood in the doorway of his own study, surrounded by the people who had once been forbidden to wish him well, and laughed, openly, unguarded, the sound of a man no longer counting the cost of his own happiness, and said, "It is, without question, the worst cake I have ever eaten, and I should like a slice of it every year for the rest of my life." If this story warmed you, the way an honest ledger warms a worried heart when it is finally, at long last, brought into balance, then stay a while longer by the fire before you go. I have kept a chair for you, and the kettle is on, and there is a robin somewhere outside that has not stopped singing since the day this story began. Tell me, before you leave, which line stayed with you longest, the many happy returns spoken into a silence that had gone on far too long, or the bad cake handed over anyway, because I love hearing which moment found its way into your own account of things. Stay close to the hearth, and if you have not already, pull your chair a little nearer the fire, and let this be the place you return to, week after week, the way this house learned to welcome its own returns again. And wherever you go from here, be gentle with the ones who never had anyone to bake them a bad cake, and be the one, if you can, who finally does.